Everyone, and welcome to this side event that has been organized, co-hosted by Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, plus Oxfam, an international youth and student movement for the United Nations, and also Center for Community Economics and Development Consultant Society. We are pleased to see each one of you. Welcome. I believe you're going to enjoy this event. It's going to be exciting. It's about cooperation, working together, and really looking at what is still pending and how do we close the post-Paris adaptation and climate finance gap. And tonight we have a strong team of panelists. I'll bring them to you later, but let me share with you the process on how we have organized this side event. To start with, we are going to see a video clip that has been prepared by Oxfam on infographics on climate change and El Nino combined effects in Africa. You look at it, deduce something from it, and at the end of it, we'll have a session to interact together, ask questions, and get to know what is new and what is yet to be addressed in regard to climate finance. We'll have presenters to present each of you. They'll take 10 minutes, and we'll have presentations up front. And the last 30 minutes, we'll have an interactive session. So I now have the pleasure to introduce our speakers, and our first speaker tonight will be Mithika Mwenda, who is the Secretary General for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, which is a coalition of over 1,500 membership in Africa with presence in 45 countries. Mr. Mithika is a public policy analyst and strategist and a veteran in climate justice. We have seen him a lot in action in quite a number of events. He also champions environmental and human rights issues, and he has experience spanning up to 10 years. And our second speaker, Mr. Mithika, is going to give us a background, particularly on where we are on adaptation and why it matters in Africa. And he'll also pick a little on what are the current gaps that are existing. Mr. Ajay, second from my far right, Mr. Ajay is Director of Center for Community Economics and Development Consultant Society and Public Advocacy Initiatives for Rights and Values in India. He also coordinates Pan-India Network Beyond Copenhagen and is a member of the board of the Asia Pacific Research Network. He has been following national and global policies and negotiations on climate change and sustainable development, financing for development, etc., for many years. So we are looking forward to really listen to him and pick his ideas on his experience. And he will talk about the challenges and opportunities in adaptation finance, the current status when it comes to Adaptation Fund, and other issues in relation to finance. Our third speaker, Ms. Hai, second to Mithika to my right. Ms. Hai is currently working as program manager for building resilience at Oxfam in Vietnam. And at the same time, she's the chair of the climate change working group of both national and international NGOs in Vietnam. Previously, she has worked for several years as disaster management delegate for the tsunami recovery program for the British Red Cross in Sri Lanka. And prior to this, she worked for International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies as the Disaster Preparedness Program Officer in Vietnam. And she has a long CV. So we are looking forward to hear from Hai and also listen to her speak to us about the experiences she has had in Vietnam, and particularly tonight she's going to dwell on transparency and accountability in climate finance. And also she will touch a little bit on what is available, what are the ideas out there. So Ms. Hai, welcome. Our last speaker, last but not least, is Maruyama, and we are happy to have you tonight with us. Maruyama Williams is the Senior Program Officer from South Center, an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. She has wealth of experience in financing, and she has been following the finance track at the UNFCCC for many years. And we are happy to have Maruyama here tonight because she's also going to touch on gender issues. Recently, she did a publication on gender and climate finance, particularly on coming out of the margins. So Maruyama, we are happy to have you tonight. Welcome. So I would request that we dim the lights. We start with our video clip for 2 minutes before I call on our first speaker. Thank you. So let's start our video. Our technicians behind, can we dim the lights?
More than just the land. Drought means cracks appear in lives, families, and countries. In 2015 and 2016, climate change and a global weather phenomenon called El Niño brought drought across 4 continents, and 60 million faced hunger because of it. Those who suffer the most from climate change do least to cause it. And so long as we all ignore the fracture between actions and their consequences, the cracks will continue to grow until it is too late. But together, we can solve this problem, not just by papering over existing cracks, but by investing now to prevent future ones from appearing. And by the way, acting early in a drought costs 50% less than acting late. No cracks in that argument. Join the fight against climate change. Tell world leaders to invest more money to stop the cracks. Together, by sharing this film, we can demand action.
Thank you. You've seen the last message there. Let's join hands to stop the crack. How do we do that, Mr. Mattock? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, the moderator, and thank you for turning up for this side event. This has been a routine for us in Africa. If my memory serves me well, the global global goal for adaptation was first advanced by the African countries, because the issue of adaptation is quite prominent, is quite urgent in the African region, because this is the continent whose communities are at the front line of the climate crisis. This is the continent which, according to science, will face the devastating consequences of climate change impacts because of our vulnerability. And so, while we acknowledge the importance of other pillars of climate change, while we acknowledge other pillars of negotiations, like mitigation, particularly to address climate change, we in Africa, our priority is adaptation. And so, in this very important side event, we will spend the next couple of minutes to really look at where we are, particularly after the Paris Agreement, and where it places us in Africa as a continent. We have the business really finished. We called it the unfinished business because many people after the Paris, after the COP21, thought that, yes, I think we have achieved everything. Paris has delivered everything. But we believe that now that is the beginning of the real action to address climate change adaptation. So there are two issues here, adaptation itself and adaptation finance, and particularly capacity building and addressing real community issues. How do we trickle this down at community level? We have been talking about billions and billions of US dollars going to adaptation. The question is, do we have really that? When the industrialized countries yell about, oh yes, we have provided climate finance in developing countries, we have been following this. We have never seen the money. So where is that money? And so one of the latest studies by Oxfam indicated that in the year 2013 to 2014, there has been reports of approximately 10 billion per year, which went to adaptation. And I want to ask actually whether I have witnesses from communities, because I can see there are community people here who have really seen the evidence of that money. The same report anyway estimates that well, the donors say that money has been 10 billion. This report indicates that there is only 4 billion US dollars, I mean 4 to 8 billion. So where is that seepage? Where is that leakage? And so there are various issues which we have to address here. How are we going to account for this kind of moving forward? How are we going to account for not only adaptation, but broader climate finance? So that's a critical issue for us, particularly as we move to implement the national determined contribution, which unfortunately are not adaptation leaning, but mitigation. We have been calling for the balance between adaptation and mitigation. The question is that going really to be achieved? And where are the details? Where is the evidence? There is a lot of rush, actually, after the Paris Agreement. We are witnessing a lot of rush for investment in various African countries. One thing, unique thing on this is that there is no excitement about investment where communities are in adaptation-related initiatives. The rush is within the renewable energy, and that is mitigation. The rush is in investment in geothermal in African countries, investment in wind power in African countries, investment in other sources of energy. And actually the unique thing, again, about this is that it is not even leading to the ownership of these communities. No. It is leading to maladaptation. How? It is leading to that because communities are being dispossessed of their land. And this is happening because what once these investors come, they find, for instance, before this event started, we had a very passionate case from one of the African countries, where a wind power company comes, it is capable of employing very good lawyers, goes and alienates thousands and thousands of acres of community land. And when that happens, the community resists, goes to court through pro bono lawyers, but eventually now they lose because they cannot be able to employ very good lawyers than this country. So these are some of the challenges communities are facing. So climate change can come in two ways. While we are fighting for adaptation, it can resort to maladaptation, and that is what we are witnessing. This report from Oxfam is very good, but how are we going as communities, as people working on climate justice? Because it is the right of these communities. They have the right to development. But are they going to achieve that when they are faced by very, very strong power of money? They face very strong opponents driven by international companies. So these are very critical questions, ladies and gentlemen. And if we are not going to have to put in place rules which are going of engagement, rules in terms of investment on climate change, related investment as we transition to low carbon development trajectories, then it is going to be complicated to these communities which are awaiting for these kind of international conventions and protocols like the Paris Agreement to help them, but which end up exacerbating the problems which they are facing. So briefly, I know my time is over. I could talk and talk about this, but really we need to look at that very broadly. We need bottom-up approaches, right-based development approaches, and looking at how communities are going to advance their interest in this very difficult situation and environment of climate change. So thank you very much. I know I could have talked much, but let me end it there so that we can have other speakers, because we have a line of them who should speak on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitika, for those few points that you have pointed out, and particularly ending the note that there is need for rules of engagements to be put in place. And I'll request our guests also to be thinking about the questions that you're going to ask the panelists in regard to the topics that they are going to speak about. By the end of it, we'll have time. You also contribute to be part of the solution. So our next speaker to speak on the challenges and opportunities that exist is Mr. Ajay. Welcome, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ruth. Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Ruth, for your kind words in my introduction. I basically represent 2-3 organizations: Center for Community Economics and Development Consultant Society, Public Advocacy Initiatives for Rights and Values. We work over many realms of areas and sectors, from right from development work in 600 villages in Rajasthan and some other states to policy advocacy at the national and global and United Nations level. I sincerely believe that the time of talking about adaptation is over now. And we should now more talk about limits to adaptation. As a famous Chinese proverb says, that the time to plant a tree was 20 years back. The second best is now. So maybe we can take the second best chance to talk about adaptation today. Why I'm saying this? Because last consecutively 18 months have broken all records of rise in temperatures. September was the second warmest September in last 137 years. But the July was hottest month, not only in terms of average temperatures of July, but of all average temperatures of all the month since these records have been started being taken right from 1800. This year only, you can imagine consecutive 18 months of record-breaking temperature and people in the vulnerable areas, how they are able to cope and whether they can cope. This year only, in droughts in India, which affected more than 300 million people across 10 states, the loss was estimated to be at $100 billion US. This can happen in one year in one country. So just to put that the figure in the context, we are looking at $100 billion and we are asking for a roadmap to $100 billion for the GCF. So that's a very small amount and that can hardly help adaptation. At various places, not only in Arctic, but at various places, we are reaching the limits of adaptation. You look at SIDS. What do you do with coral reefs in Australia? What do you do with people in Maldives and Bangladesh who are living their life in months and months of submergence continuously? Just a small example of how we are reaching limits is that I'll give you is about rice cultivation in South Asia. The threshold temperature limit is 26 degrees Celsius in the night. And every 1 degree Celsius increase will reduce the yield by less than 10%. It's impossible to cope with or adapt to these kind of circumstances. What we are doing in that context, my assessment is that we are doing next to nothing. The UNEP emission gap report released on 3rd November says that the 2030, we are going to have an emission gap of 8 to 12 gigatons, 12 to 14 gigatons by 2030. And they have analyzed all the NDCs submitted, and they say, they reiterate that we are on a track to have a rise in temperature beyond 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. These are the situations which cannot be solved by adaptation. And there are limits to adaptation. How long can we ask people who are living in the vulnerable areas to adapt, and continue adapting? So there have to be different modalities. And the first critical area is to reduce the emission. Just 3 days back in the APA plenary, ASU said a statement quoting a research, said that 13 of the NX1 countries have, rather than reducing their emissions have risen from 1990s, not by 2% or 4% or 6% or 10%. It's by 25%, 45%, and more than that. That shows that we are almost doing next to nothing. UNEP report says that we need to reduce the emission by 25% more than have been pledged in the NDCs to stay on the least cost pathways to 2 degrees Celsius. Nobody seems to be taking that seriously. In many cases, NDCs have lower ambitions than Cancun pledges. Talking about what we have been doing, many of you might be informed that only 7 of the 37 countries who were supposed to contribute to emission reduction in the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period have ratified the Doha Amendment Act. The lack of finances is an issue in the GCF, but lack of finances is more severe when you look at Adaptation Fund. Many of you will remember that last time Adaptation Fund board chairman shared a report with the COP asking that Adaptation Fund is facing severe financial crisis. They had hoped to mobilize resources up to the tune of $160 million from, say, 2014 to 2015. but they could raise only half of that amount, even with the donations of some countries like Germany, which contributed to 54 million. Sweden contributed to something like 27 million and things like that. Not only that, the sustainability of Adaptation Fund itself is in a crisis. They need an amount of, say, 8 million per year for their sustainability, but that is also difficult to come by. And in the recent years, they had to reduce and remove their staff to cope up with the financial crisis. $8 million. To put that in the perspective, Hillary Clinton just spent $42 million in her electoral campaign. Therefore, I mean, adaptation definitely needs a stronger and more sustainable adaptation fund, which could give more focus to adaptation projects. There are several estimates of what is the financial support going to adaptation. UNEP's Adaptation Finance Gap report, which was also released on 3rd November this year, says that in 2014, adaptation finance was up to the tune of 25 billion, mostly from multilateral development banks, and approximately 18% of that money was in the form of low-cost debt and market rate debts. And these debts, mind you, not grants, are not going to emerging developing countries. These are going to East Asia and the Pacific, which have still lower capacity. The report says that the cost of the adaptation will rise 2 to 3 times by 2030, and it will rise by 4 to 5 times by 2050. Previous estimates of what is best financial resources that will be required to meet the cost of adaptation in developing countries. Previous estimates were ranging between $70 billion per year to maybe $140 billion per year by 2015. Now, with the analysis of national, NDCs and sectoral reports, the estimate rises to 280 billion to 500 billion per year by 2050. Adaptation finances, as compared to what is available today, needs to be increased by 6 to 13 times by 2030 and 12 to 22 times by 2050. Finance is a very complicated matter, and you read several estimates, you read several reports, and you can't understand which one is true. For that matter, I gave you the estimates of UNEP. Biennial assessment report of overflow of climate finance, which was 2016, says that climate finance was total climate finance, not only adaptation finance. Total climate finance was of the tune of $26.2 billion in 2014. ISMUN countries did not like the figure. They reversed the numbers. They are saying that the finance mobilized in 2014 was $62 billion. And less than 30% of that climate finance goes to adaptation. The question is whether there is enough money in the world. Can we afford adaptation and mitigation? Just to give you a sense of what is the money available or the money which can be mobilized, bank bailouts in the US in the wake of financial crisis amounted to $700 billion. And that was the amount which Senate approved. There are various estimates that this bank bailout is still going, and the governments have committed an amount of 4.6 trillions, of which 16.8 trillions, of which 4.6 trillions have been already paid. UK was not to be left behind. In the bank bailout, UK's contribution amounted to 500 billion pounds. So, but in contrast, if you see that EU had to have a deal only for 7 billion euros for the lives of more than 500,000 refugees living in Turkey. So that shows where is the money available and where is the money going. The best insurance to manage the adaptation cost is to have deep and early actions before 2020. Deep and early mitigation cuts before 2020 will also ensure that governments are able to deliver SDGs by 2030. If we fail to take deep and meaningful mitigation actions before 2020, that will jeopardize countries' ability to deliver major climate goals like access to energy, sustainable cities, terrestrial ecosystems, hunger and food security, gender. Failure to deliver on these counts will endanger maintenance of whatever gains that we can have from SDGs post 2030 also. Finances are not an issue, as I said earlier also, but there is a need for, how many minutes? It's over. Yeah, I'm finishing. There's a need for serious reorganization of global power in terms of money, in terms of trade, and in terms of aid. I'll stop here. I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I did not want to stop you, Mr. Ajay. You've given us facts that are very important, because once we have facts, it's easier to make arguments and demand for change and for immediate action, or else the cracks will continue becoming bigger. Thank you so much. We didn't belabor, but what I picked very important is that adaptation is not the only solution. There is also an urgency to do mitigation cuts at an early stage. Thank you so much. Our next speaker, hi, you're welcome. Take it up, tell us about how can we be transparent and accountable in the process, and also give us solutions. How do we take it forward? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy today to be on behalf of Oxfam to present our findings of the research. And then we talk about, or we request for sufficient and accountable adaptation finance that are benefiting the most vulnerable communities. So there are three key messages here. The first one is that if global cooperation on climate change is to be inclusive, durable, and fair, it must not leave anybody behind. Here we want to talk about the people in the vulnerable communities who are suffering from the impacts of climate change. We listened to the previous presenters, and we can also understand how the communities are being affected. And the second point is that adaptation finance gaps need to be addressed urgently with action at COP22, and then after that as well. And the third point is that developing country governments need to put system in place to ensure that finance reaches the most vulnerable people and communities in the context of climate change. Yeah, I think that it doesn't move. Anyway, so we would like to request that developed countries to increase adaptation finance. Yeah, as the previous presenter said, the UNEP assess is that the adaptation finance need for the developing countries will be from 140 to 300 billion per year by 2030. And then needs are urgent and rising. And then when we talk about the impacts of climate change, and especially this year with the El Nino impacts, only in Africa, an additional 40 million people face hunger. Yeah, and developed countries also need to increase adaptation finance, because if we look at the roadmap, and then the public adaptation finance should be doubled by 2020. And then Oxfam estimate that by 2020, public finance for adaptation will not be more than 20% of the 100 billion US dollar. And this is very small compared to the ambitions of the balanced adaptation and mitigation agreed in the Paris Agreement. And this gap needs to be closed urgently. And then we request that the global adaptation finance goal will be 35 billion US dollar by 2020. And this should be new and additional public finance, and especially the grant, and they should not be loan. Why the 35 billion US dollar is not sufficient, but we think that at least it's, if we get the commitment to this amount, it will be showing the political commitment from the developed governments. And then for the developing countries, they should ensure that climate finance reach the most vulnerable people and the communities. So first, by focusing on supporting or prioritizing agricultural production, or the reason why is that the agricultural productions are the cornerstone of the developing countries, and which are very prone to climate change impacts. And the fact is that more than 90% of the developing countries prioritize agricultural production in their for their adaptation in their INDCs. And small-scale farmers, especially women, lack a support despite of the huge role in ensuring food security. And then I think that from also the other presenters, we see that they are the one who are doing a lot of work in agricultural production, but they didn't get the kind of support that they need. And small-scale producers represent 80% of farms in Pakistan, and more than that in Ethiopia. And then women, on average, account for 43% of the agricultural labor force in developing countries, and in some other countries, this figure is much higher. So Oxfam started a research earlier this year in 6 countries, including Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So the research looked into the quantity and quality of adaptation finance and how they are invested in agricultural production. And the focus was also on the issues that whether the finance reaches the farmers, smallholder farmers that are women or not. So most of the countries are still in the process of finalizing their analysis of information, and then the final reports are not issued yet. But here we want to share some initial findings. So if we talk about climate justice, we look at Pakistan, and then we see that the loss due to climate change have reached 2 billion, and this accounted for about nearly half of the ODA money flowing to Pakistan. Although the Pakistan government have allocated a lot of or quite a big sum of money for adaptation in their capacity, but this is still very small compared to the needs. And so I think that we have figures there. So for about women, in Vietnam, for example, gender equality principles have been included in key climate change policy, but in terms of implementation, it's not very clear. Although the NGOs have been working in this area and try to support the mainstreaming of gender equality in all the work related to climate change adaptation and mitigation, but it's still at a very small scale, and we need to have it scale up. So, and the next point is that about transparency and accountability. In Ghana, there has been a very good attempt in tracking the climate finance in its budget allocation. There are still limitations, but this is at least a good example, and they need to be supported to improve more. Local adaptation planning. In Pakistan, 6 districts in Punjab have endorsed participatory local adaptation plans of action, identifying the local options for adaptation with the participation of the communities, and then integrate those measures into their development plans. This approach to participatory planning and also integration of climate change adaptation and mitigation into the local socio-economic development plans also have been promoted and piloted by many NGOs in Vietnam, and then we are advocating for this to be endorsed and replicated by the government in Vietnam. And then if we talk about how the money was spent in Vietnam, 90% of the climate change expenditures between 2010 to 2012, it was mainly for the irrigation and road projects. And then this means that the funding, the finance for measures identified by the communities for the benefits of the most vulnerable people in the affected or the high-risk area should be increased. And in conclusion, the developed countries should increase finance for adaptation, and adequate finance to implement national and local climate change plans and policies are needed. Increase transparencies in the climate finance so that the finance will be recorded at the national and international level. And increase accountability especially on the participation in defining causes of action by the most affected people. And then the last point is that the focus on vulnerable people and communities should be applying the bottom-up assessment of vulnerability. That means the participation of vulnerable groups, such as the poor, the women, the elderly, disabled people, and then the ethnic minorities should be taken into consideration and then should be promoted. So I will end my presentation here, and then if any questions, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hai, for those facts and figures. We see that there are possible solutions, and she's challenging us not to settle for less. We need to demand for more finances, because the needs are great. Thank you. Last but not the least, Maruyama, you have the floor.
How do I do this again? So,
Yeah.
It's okay, it's on.
it's on? Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your participation in this panel. And thank to PACJA and ISMUN and the community agency for inviting me to participate here. And I've really learned quite a lot from listening to the 3 previous presentations. My job is kind of to mop up a bit and fill any gaps, since most of the especially the 2 last presentations have spoke significantly about the financing challenge. So I will try not to revisit some of those grounds, but to pick up on some areas that I think may need to be emphasized or put a little bit more emphasis on. Well, I think the point has been made that the Paris Agreement was not a panacea. It was not a magic bullet that suddenly is going to solve the challenges that have been bedeviling this convention. And the reason why people have been coming here since 1992, almost on a yearly, 1995 onwards, really almost on a yearly basis. And it doesn't look like we're going to be able to stop coming to COP anytime soon, because the problems are still here, and they're perverse and they're growing, as has been stated by AJ. So what are the challenges that are left? And they're quite exhaustive, so I won't go into them, but I'll just flag a few. Of course, one of the major challenges is to really increase the discussion and the actions around adaptation, in terms of, I know up to Paris, we talked a lot about an adaptation goal, which had various tension and contentions around it. But nonetheless, the adaptation did get some place holding within the Paris Agreement. But we need to do a lot more work on case studies around adaptation, bringing the different challenges of adaptation in different regions and countries to the forefront, but also bringing the different challenges of adaptation that are faced by women and men and indigenous peoples in their various specificity and regions. So that's one thing. I think significant work needs to be done around adaptation. I think also significant work needs to be done around loss and damage. Loss and damage is one of the areas that was least served in the Paris Agreement, in the sense that we had provision in the outcome document as well as the Paris Agreement that broke the link between adaptation and between loss and damage and finance. And that struggle is still going on under the ORSA international mechanism, so that the elaboration of the need for loss and damage in a compensatory framework must continue. And so the elaboration of that. And I think you've made the point to show that adaptation at some point fails. And what do you do when adaptation fails? You have to look at the issue of loss and damage. And so the whole idea of compensation, climate justice, and climate debt is still a very big issue that needs to be strongly pushed and strongly urged on both our governments, who are always reluctant to bring that up, but both to the developed countries. So I think loss and damage and the linking back to the need for compensation, and that loss and damage simply cannot be fixed by insurance mechanisms, which is what the many governments would like to push. It doesn't solve the problem. Then the other area, I think, is the challenge about the continuing imbalance between adaptation finance and mitigation finance. And I know that within the Paris Agreement, there was the provision that there should be a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And also within the Green Climate Fund, there is a commitment to a 50-50 balance between adaptation and mitigation. But when you look on the roadmap, that was presented in terms of leveraging up the $100 billion, there is no commitment to balance adaptation. What they say is that they will double adaptation finance, which in their estimations, based on the OECD document that was prepared last year, is about $10 billion 2013 to 2014. So doubling adaptation means $20 billion, or 1/5 of the $100 billion. Now, if you put that against the UNEP report that says the cost of adaptation will be somewhere from $140 to $300 billion by 2030, or up to $500 billion by 2050, then $20 billion is woefully inadequate. Also, HIE has flagged that the $35 billion is one of the asks on the table. And so that it's even way away from that, but the reality of what adaptation means is not there. The link between adaptation and mitigation, we know the extent to which we need to adapt depends a lot on the extent to which mitigation has been successful. The least successful mitigation is the more adaptation or loss and damage we will incur. So that we need to keep the synergy between adaptation and mitigation going. My fifth point, I think by this time, is that the importance of integrating a gender analysis and a gender framework within both looking at climate change, adaptation, mitigation, but also in the financing. Because there is the case that we make, and within the context of the Green Climate Fund, there is a gender sensitization process that has been completed, and there's a gender action plan that the fund has to integrate gender analysis and gender criteria into all aspects of its funding modalities. But when you actually look at the projects, the 9 million or so projects that were funded up until June of this year, there's very little of the gender consideration that have gone into the criterias. So, and also when we look at the Lima Work Program on Gender and the commitment that parties made to increase the gender representation of women in delegation, and that was going up very significantly. But if you go back and you look at the Paris numbers, it's dropped. Yeah. That across most all delegations who came to Paris, there's a significant drop in the number of women who were part of the delegation. So you see that instead of progressing, there's this drop off. Yeah. So again, the push on the Lima Work Program to take significantly action in terms of representation, but also to bring in more issues of what's going on the ground, the kinds of things that you've pointed out it's happening in Vietnam and in Pakistan and other areas in Africa, to bring those case studies. And I sat through the session that was here before our session began and heard a lot of the presenters, and the discussion also talked about what was happening on the ground and the role of women and men in adaptation activities on the ground. So I think we have a significant amount of challenge in terms of mopping up the existing challenges that existed, but also some issues that have been raised in the Paris Agreement. So I don't know how many of you know that one of the gaps in the Paris Agreement is that it said that the financial mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, are to serve the Paris Agreement. But the Adaptation Fund was not carried over as part of that. And so the struggle that's been going on, at least today, and it will be probably going on right now, is to try to get a decision to make the Adaptation Fund also be carried over into the Paris Agreement. Now, why is that important, and what's the concern of the G77? The Adaptation Fund has been pointed out here, it's suffering, it's underfunded. So they're on a fundraising campaign of 80 million per year for 2016, 2017. The Adaptation Fund is primarily funded from CDM, selling CERs, and that market has collapsed, so the fund has been perennially underfunded. It got some money from the pledges in 2015, but not enough to fill it up. And so the Adaptation Fund is very vulnerable. So it needs to be also recognized as serving the Paris Agreement. And the concern, I think, from some parties, if you listen to the discussion in the room earlier, remember, not all parties are members of the KP. And the Adaptation Fund is linked to the Kyoto Protocol. So countries like the US, Australia, Canada, and others who are not committed to the second commitment period, there are concerns about the allocation of funding and various obligations, though that's not said at the table. What they say at the table is that we're not quite sure about the Adaptation Fund, so we just can't agree yet to it going into the Paris Agreement. We need more studies and more discussion. And the G77 is like, what could be confusing about the Adaptation Fund? We discussed it when we set it up. We've discussed it. In Paris, you said we couldn't do it because the Adaptation Fund comes under the CMP, so it couldn't be a COP decision. Well, the CMP has said it's okay for the Adaptation Fund to be part of the COP. So what's the problem now? So we see this stalling. And so the effort now really is to really make sure that we regird the Adaptation Fund. Be mindful that the Adaptation Fund is the only fund that is purely about funding adaptation projects. The GEF does not fund adaptation. The GCF has a commitment to fund. And it will, if you look on the report, you'll hear that 50% of the GCF projects were adaptation fund. But if you look at the value of it, you'll see that it's not 50% of the total amount of money that was used. It's actually very small numerically. 50% of the projects were adaptation fund. But in terms of value, it's not 50%. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to push the GCF to honor the commitment, 50-50, but not just 50-50 in terms of numbers, counting projects, but in terms of the actual volume and value of what's funded. And we need to also make sure that here and by bond, hopefully by here, that it's a decision to bring the Adaptation Fund into the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I think she has said it very well. We still have work to do. There's a lot to be done. Before the end of next week, there's a lot to be done. And I think we have the negotiators around us and friends of goodwill. We can already start mapping out how do we go about this. There's a lot of need, and we don't have the money. Even the baskets that we have